Reuben Bancroft had rehearsed the words 100 times before he ever pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the ridge. He had rehearsed them in the dark of the bunkhouse, while the other ranch hands snored around him. He had rehearsed them in the saddle during the 3-mile ride through the sagebrush and the dry morning wind. He had rehearsed them until the syllables had lost all their meaning and become nothing more than sounds, hollow and automatic, the way a man recites a prayer he no longer believes in but cannot stop saying. The words were simple. He had designed them to be simple, because simple was cleanest and clean was kindest. He would tell her that the arrangement had been a mistake. He would tell her that Craddock County was no place for a woman who had come all this way on a hope, that the ranch could not support another person through the winter, that she ought to get back on the eastbound stage before it left Laredo on Thursday morning. He would be firm. He would be measured. He would not look at her too long. He was still working on that last part when he crested the ridge and saw her. She was standing in the yard of the small waystation, where he had arranged for her to wait. She was standing with her back to him, one hand raised to shield her eyes from the southwest sun, looking out across the mesa as if she had already decided that whatever came next, she would face it without flinching. She wore a simple blue calico dress that had been pressed at some point in the last week, but had surrendered to the dust of travel at the hem. Her dark hair was pinned up but not perfectly, a few strands loose at the back of her neck where the wind had found them. She was not what he had pictured, because he had spent the last 4 months trying hard not to picture her at all. Then she turned, and every word Reuben Bancroft had ever learned left him. He sat on his horse at the top of the ridge, and he could not speak, could not move, could not do one single thing except look at her face, because it was not the face he had braced himself for. It was not the face of a desperate woman who had answered a stranger's notice out of some dark and hidden motive. It was not strategic or calculating or closed. It was open. It was tired and hopeful and quietly fierce all at once, the way a candle flame looks when the wind is pressing against it from all sides and it refuses to go out. She looked up at him across the distance, and she did not smile immediately, did not flutter or perform. She simply looked, as though she was measuring him the same way he was measuring her, and whatever she found, she was prepared to deal with honestly. Reuben felt the rehearsed words dissolve like sugar in rain. He had ridden out here to turn her away. He stayed for the rest of his life. But that is the end of the story, and to understand how a man arrives at such a moment, you have to go back to the beginning, to the advertisement, to the letter, to the particular desperate loneliness of the spring of 1878 in Craddock County, Texas. The advertisement had not been Reuben's idea. That needed to be said immediately and clearly, because Reuben Bancroft was the kind of man who did not believe in shortcuts and who distrusted any arrangement that did not grow naturally from work and time. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, quiet by nature, and had spent the better part of a decade building the Silver Creek ranch from a foreclosed property with a leaking roof and 40 head of starving cattle into something that resembled a real working operation. He had done it alone mostly. His older brother Gideon had helped in the early years, but had gone to New Mexico in 1875 after marrying a widow from Albuquerque, and their father had died of a lung infection the previous winter, leaving Reuben, the sole Bancroft, on 640 acres of Texas grassland and river bottom. It was the foreman, an angular and opinionated man named Pete Holloway, who had left the copy of the matrimonial news on the kitchen table one evening in January of 1878 without a word of explanation. Reuben had picked it up expecting it to be something Pete had brought for himself, and then he had read the circled notices, and then he had set the paper down and gone to bed. In the morning the paper was still there. He left it on the table for 2 weeks. Then, one night in February when the wind was hammering the north side of the house and the loneliness had weight to it, a physical pressure behind the sternum, he had read the circled notices again. He had not written a letter that night. He had written one 3 weeks later in March, after the spring drive and before the planting, when he had an hour of quiet and could think clearly. He had written it the way he did most things, plainly and without embellishment. He was a rancher of modest but stable means. He was 31. He was not given to drinking or gambling beyond a reasonable degree. He wanted a woman who was honest and not afraid of hard work, and who understood that the frontier was not a romantic destination but a real place with real difficulties. He had posted it, immediately regretted it, and tried not to think about it for several weeks. The letter that came back in late April was not what he expected. He expected, if anything came at all, something eager. He expected the careful performance of a woman trying to sell herself into a favorable position. He expected the hidden motive, the dark past being varnished over, the desperation dressed up as enthusiasm. He had warned himself about all of those things. What he got was a letter from a woman named Ella Norris of Cincinnati, Ohio, who was 26 years old, and who wrote with the straightforward economy of someone who had learned long ago that honesty was less exhausting than pretense. She told him that she had been a school teacher for 3 years and had been let go when the school board in her district hired a man for half again less pay, which she described without bitterness, but with the kind of frank assessment that told him she had thought carefully about what it meant. She told him her mother had died 2 years ago and her father the year before that. She had one younger brother who was apprenticed to a printer in Cleveland and who was settled and did not need her. She was not, she wrote, answering his notice because she had romantic fantasies about the West. She was answering it because she was a practical woman in an impractical situation, because she needed somewhere to belong, and because his letter was the only one among several she had read that had not tried to impress her. She asked him 3 questions at the end of the letter. She asked whether the nearest town had a physician. She asked whether she would have any autonomy over the household accounts. She asked, with no apparent irony, whether he was the kind of man who listened when someone was talking or the kind who waited for the noise to stop. Reuben read those 3 questions standing at the kitchen table in the early morning and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. He wrote back the same afternoon. He told her the town of Laredo had 2 physicians. He told her that whoever ran the household should run the household accounts, because he was better with cattle than numbers and he knew it. And he told her, after sitting with a pen over the paper for a long time, that he believed himself to be the kind of man who listened, though he acknowledged that this was the kind of claim a person could only prove over time and not in a letter. She wrote back in 2 weeks. They wrote back and forth for 4 months. Those 4 months were the part that had not been in the plan. Reuben had expected the correspondence to be perfunctory, a verification of practical details, the establishing of mutual expectations. And in the beginning, it was something like that, careful and measured on both sides. But letters take time in transit, and when you are waiting for an answer, you think more carefully about what you wrote, and when the answer arrives, you read it more than once. By May, Reuben was reading her letters 3 and 4 times. By June, he was aware that he had begun to listen for the postman the way he listened for weather. She told him things. She told him about the school in Cincinnati, about the particular difficulty of teaching reading to children who arrived hungry, about the boy in her 2nd grade class who had been determined to be unteachable, and whom she had taught to read by using the labels on the cans in the school's storage closet, because he liked to know what things were. She told him about the river, and the particular way the city sounded at night. She told him she was afraid sometimes, that the prospect of traveling so far to marry a man she had never seen was something she lay awake thinking about, and that she had decided the only honest thing to do was say so rather than pretend she felt no fear at all. He told her things too, things he had not said to anyone. He told her about his father and the long final winter. He told her about the cattle drive of 1875 that had gone catastrophically wrong in a flooded river crossing, and cost him 11 head, and nearly cost him Pete Holloway, and how he had pulled Pete out of the current by the collar, and how neither of them had spoken about it since because that was not the kind of men they were. He told her that he had lived alone in the ranch house for so long that he had stopped using the front room because there was no reason to heat a room nobody sat in, and that he had forgotten to notice how strange that was until he wrote it down. By July, Reuben understood that something in these letters had gone past the practical arrangement he had intended, and this understanding frightened him in a way that nothing in 640 acres of Texas frontier had frightened him before, because it was one thing to be lonely. Loneliness was manageable. You worked through it the way you worked through drought or a poor calf crop, but this was something else. This was the beginning of caring about a specific person, a woman he had never seen, a woman who was traveling toward him on a riverboat and then a stage, and if he cared about her before she arrived, then he was exposed in a way that a man in his position could not afford to be, because there was a secret he had not told her. And in the summer of 1878, that secret was pressing on him like a stone on his chest. The previous autumn, a man named Dalton Cross had ridden onto Silver Creek Ranch and presented Reuben with a document that he claimed proved the original land patent for the eastern 320 acres of the Silver Creek property had been improperly transferred in 1869, when the land was sold after the previous owner's bankruptcy. Cross was a land speculator from San Antonio with a lawyer and a dark talent for finding buried legal weakness in frontier property titles. He had used this talent to take 3 other ranches in the county before setting his sights on Silver Creek. His claim was partly fraudulent. Reuben was nearly certain, but nearly certain and legally certain were 2 different things, and the cost of the court fight would be significant. Reuben had already spent $400 on a lawyer in Laredo named Hargreaves, and Hargreaves was cautiously optimistic, and cautiously optimistic was not the same as winning. If Cross succeeded, Reuben would lose the eastern pastures, the river access, and roughly half the ranch's value. It would not destroy Silver Creek entirely, but it would damage it severely. And a severely damaged Silver Creek was not the stable, modest operation he had described to Ella Norris of Cincinnati in his March letter. He had not told her about Cross. He had told himself he would wait until the legal matter resolved. He had told himself this with diminishing conviction through May, June, and July, as the matter showed no signs of resolving, and as Ella's stage departure date from Cincinnati was confirmed for the 3rd week of August. By August, with the date fixed and the letters coming with a warmth that he could not pretend not to feel, the secret had become a trap of his own making. If he told her now, she would wonder why he had waited. If he did not tell her and she arrived and the case went badly, he would have brought a woman 1,800 miles under false pretenses. And the more real she became to him in those letters, the more intolerable both options felt. He made his decision on a hot Tuesday morning in August, 2 weeks before her stage was due in Laredo. He told Pete Holloway, who listened with the expression of a man who had expected something like this. He told Hargreaves, who told him to wait for the court date, which was now scheduled for October. And then he sat down and began composing a letter to Ella Norris telling her that the arrangement would have to be postponed, that he could not in good conscience receive her into an uncertain situation, that he was sorry. He wrote 4 drafts. He burned all 4. He could not write the letter. Every time he got to the part where he was supposed to explain the postponement, the words felt dishonest in a way that the truth would not have felt, because the truth was not just that the ranch was in legal peril. The truth was that he was frightened. He was frightened of needing someone. He was frightened of what it would mean if she came and it was real and then something took it away. So he made a decision that was, in retrospect, the worst decision of his adult life. He would not write. He would let her arrive at the waystation in Laredo as arranged, because he had already sent the directions and the fare assistance, and then he would ride out and meet her and explain in person and send her back east before things could go any further. Seeing her face to face, he told himself, would be easier than the letters. Seeing her face to face, he told himself, would make the necessary words come. She would be real and present, and therefore he would be able to deal with her practically, the way he dealt with practical problems, directly and without sentiment. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. She was standing in the yard of the Callaway waystation on the morning of September the 3rd, 1878, and she was looking at the mesa, and then she turned and he saw her face, and the words he had rehearsed for 100 miles of Texas road turned to nothing in his mouth. He sat on that ridge for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably closer to 10 seconds, and during that time his horse moved beneath him with the patient fidgeting of an animal that had done its job and wanted to be done with it. Then Ella Norris raised her hand and gave him a small, quiet wave, not a greeting exactly but an acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you up there, whenever you are ready." He rode down. He dismounted at the hitching post, and she walked toward him across the yard, and they stood 3 feet apart and looked at each other. She was not as tall as he had somehow imagined, though he was not sure why he had imagined any particular height. Her eyes were gray and direct. There was a traveling case at her feet and a canvas bag on the porch behind her, and the particular composed exhaustion of a woman who had been on the road for 11 days and was not going to let that fact get the better of her. Reuben opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Ella Norris watched him for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that was even and unhurried and carried a slight Ohio River cadence to it that he had not been expecting, "You came out here to tell me something difficult." It was not a question. He looked at her. He said, "How did you know?" "Because you rode up to the ridge and stopped," she said. "And you sat there. A man who is simply arriving doesn't do that. A man who is working out how to say something difficult does." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are very perceptive." "I was a school teacher," she said. "I learned to read people before they knew they were being read." She paused. "Tell me whatever it is, Mr. Bancroft. I have been on a stage for 11 days. I would rather know what I am dealing with." So he told her. He stood in the dirt yard of the Callaway waystation in the September heat of 1878, and he told her everything. He told her about Dalton Cross and the land patent and the court case in October. He told her about Hargreaves and the cautious optimism and the $400 already spent. He told her that he had intended to write and warn her, but had not been able to write the letter, and that he had ridden out this morning planning to send her back on the Thursday stage. He told her all of it in the straightforward way that he had described in his March letter and that he had apparently not managed to sustain through the summer. When he was done, he waited. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard and lifted one of those loose strands of dark hair and set it down again. Then she said, "Is the ranch genuinely worth fighting for? Separate from the legal difficulty, is it a sound operation?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "And Hargreaves thinks the claim is partly fraudulent." "He does." "Then," she said, in exactly the tone she had probably used when she told a second grader to pick up his pencil and try again, "I don't see why I need to get back on the stage." Reuben stared at her. "Mr. Bancroft," she said, "I am 26 years old and I came 1,800 miles because I decided to. I didn't decide to come here because I thought the frontier was going to be uncomplicated. I decided because I thought the man I'd been corresponding with was honest, and even if he was a bit slow about being honest, he did eventually get there. That is more than I can say for a great many people." "You're not angry," he said. Was not certain whether this was a statement or a question. "I'm a little angry," she said calmly, "but I am not foolish. There is a difference." He had no response to this. He had absolutely no response to this woman. He picked up her traveling case. She picked up the canvas bag. He tied her cases to the saddle. "There's a second horse for you at the livery in Laredo," he said. "I should have brought it, but I wasn't planning to need it." "We can walk to town," she said. "How far?" 3 miles. "I've walked further." They walked. And that was how Ella Norris arrived at Silver Creek Ranch in the first week of September, 1878, not as the woman Reuben Bancroft had been planning to turn away, but as something he could not yet name and was slightly terrified to examine too closely. The ranch house was better than she had been half expecting and worse than it might have been. It was a solid adobe structure with a proper wooden porch and 4 rooms, though the front room was almost entirely unfurnished in the way Reuben had described in his letter, with only a single wooden chair near the fireplace. She stood in the front room doorway and looked at it for a moment. "You weren't exaggerating," she said. "I never exaggerate," he said. "No," she said, looking at him. "I don't think you do." Pete Holloway met them in the yard when they arrived, looked at Ella with undisguised surprise and very visible relief, shook her hand with the careful formality of a man who rarely shook women's hands and wanted to get it right, and then looked at Reuben with an expression that said everything he was too diplomatic to say out loud. Reuben, to his credit, did not respond to this expression. The arrangement they settled into in those first weeks was necessarily careful, because they were still 2 strangers who had only ever known each other through letters, and who were now living on the same property. Reuben was in the main house, and Ella had the foreman's small attached quarters, which had been empty since Pete had moved into the bunkhouse 2 years prior. This was proper, and both of them understood it was proper. They were not yet married. The question of whether they would be married had been tactfully left unresolved for the moment, suspended while they took each other's measure in reality rather than on paper. They took meals together. This was the first and most significant way they came to know each other as real people, because a meal requires conversation and conversation requires honesty or reveals the lack of it. The first meal was uncomfortable in the stiff specific way of 2 people who have been intimate in letters and have now discovered that letters are not the same as proximity. They talked about the cattle, about the county, about the weather pattern that Pete said suggested a dry fall. They did not talk about the things they had written to each other, as if those letters had been a different conversation between different people and they needed to start fresh. The second meal was better. Ella asked about the eastern pastures and Reuben explained the river access and the seasonal grazing pattern, and she asked questions that were so precisely intelligent that he stopped in the middle of an answer and looked at her, and she said, "I grew up reading everything I could find. The West was in every paper in Cincinnati for years. I probably know more about ranching in theory than I do in practice." "Theory and practice are different things," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "That's why I'm here and not reading about it." By the end of the first week, she had taken over the household accounts and identified a systematic overcharge from the supply merchant in Laredo that amounted to $11 over the preceding 3 months. She presented this to Reuben at dinner with the same even directness she brought to everything, and he looked at the figures and said, "I'll speak to Morrison tomorrow." "I'll speak to Morrison," she said. "It will be more effective." He looked at her. "He'll be less likely to argue with me," she said. "Men like Morrison don't like to seem like they've been caught overcharging a woman. It makes them feel embarrassed rather than confrontational." Reuben thought about this and concluded she was right and said so. She went to Morrison's general store the next morning and came back with a corrected account and a $4 cash credit, and Morrison apparently could not bring himself to meet her eyes when she left. "You're very good at that," Reuben said that evening. "At being underestimated," she said. "At knowing how rooms work," he said. "How people work." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen table. Then she said, "When you don't have much power in a situation, you learn to understand it. You learn to find the leverage points that are available to you." He heard the weight in those words. He said, "Is that what brought you out here? Lack of options?" She looked at him directly. "I had options," she said. "I could have gone to stay with my brother in Cleveland. I could have taken in laundry. I could have married a widower in Cincinnati who had 4 children and needed someone to run his house, which was more or less what he told me when he proposed. The question is not whether I had options. The question is what kind of life I wanted." "And you chose this," he said, meaning the frontier, the uncertainty, the arrangement. "I chose the letters," she said quietly. "The rest is what came with them." The silence after that sentence was the longest and most significant silence they had yet shared. It was in the second week that they began, slowly and carefully, to find the version of each other that lived outside the letters. Reuben was more taciturn in person than his letters had suggested, because writing had given him time to formulate thoughts that in conversation he would have let pass. But he was a good listener in exactly the way he had claimed. He did not finish her sentences or redirect her when she was talking. He waited, and when she was done he thought before he responded. This was rare enough in 1878 that she noticed it. She was more stubborn in person than her letters had suggested. Not combatively stubborn, not the kind of stubborn that planted its feet and refused to reason. It was the quiet persistence of someone who had learned that if she did not hold her ground, nobody would hold it for her. This quality had frustrated two employers, an uncle who had tried to manage her finances after her father died, and the widower with the 4 children. Reuben found, to his own moderate surprise, that he did not find it frustrating at all. He found it clarifying. You always knew where you stood with Ella Norris. In the second week she began working on the front room. She did not ask permission. She moved the single chair to one side, measured the space with a piece of string, went to the furniture dealer in Laredo, and came back with a written estimate for a settee and 2 side tables that was significantly lower than it would have been if Reuben had gone himself, because she had negotiated with calm and methodical precision, and the furniture dealer had found himself agreeing to terms he had not intended to agree to. Reuben looked at the estimate and signed off on it and did not comment on the negotiation, because he was learning when to speak and when to simply acknowledge that something had been done well. The furniture arrived on the following Wednesday. She arranged it herself. The front room had a fire in it that evening for the first time in 2 years. They sat in it together after dinner, on opposite sides of the settee with a cautious distance between them, and Reuben looked around the room that he had stopped using and that now felt inhabited again, and something moved through him that he could not quite articulate. "Thank you," he said. She looked at the fire. "Everyone deserves a room to sit in," she said. The third week brought the first real crisis. A writer came in on a Thursday morning with a letter from Hargreaves in Laredo. The court date had been moved. The judge who had been assigned to the case had taken ill and been replaced with a judge named Aldrich who had, in Hargreaves's carefully worded assessment, certain professional connections to Dalton, Cross's legal representation that were worth noting. The new date was set for October the 8th, and Hargreaves wanted a meeting. Reuben read the letter twice. His face did not change in the way that telegraphed emotion, but the set of his jaw shifted. Ella, who had been correcting the account ledger at the kitchen table, watched him fold the letter. "Is it the land case?" she asked. He told her about the judge. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "May I come to the meeting with Hargreaves?" He looked at her. "It's a legal matter." "I know it's a legal matter," she said. "I can read. Would you like me to come or not?" He thought about this. He thought about the 3 questions at the end of her first letter, about the way she had handled Morrison, about the furniture estimate. He said yes. They rode to Laredo on Saturday. This was the first time they had ridden together, and it was, Reuben discovered, a different kind of proximity than sitting across a table. There was something about sharing the road with someone, the same pace, the same horizon, that was more intimate than a conversation. He was acutely aware of her beside him in a way that he was not comfortable examining. Hargreaves was a thin, fussy man with excellent legal instincts and the social manner of a man who had spent too long alone with documents. He looked at Ella when she entered with the polite puzzlement of a man who had not expected a woman at this meeting and was recalibrating. She shook his hand and told him she had read the relevant section of Texas land patent law that she had found in the county clerk's office, and his polite puzzlement became something closer to attention. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Ella asked 4 questions that Hargreaves admitted were the right 4 questions. The most significant was whether Cross's original document had been registered with the county clerk at the time of the alleged original transfer, or only recently, because if it had only been registered recently, the timing itself raised questions about its authenticity. Hargreaves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will need to check the registration date." "I would check it this week," Ella said pleasantly. "If it was registered recently, that seems like the center of the case." Reuben watched this exchange with the feeling of a man who is discovering that something he thought he understood has more dimensions than he realized. He had understood from the letters that she was intelligent and direct. He had not understood the particular quality of her intelligence, which was practical and lateral, the kind that found the load-bearing wall in a structure and pressed on it. They rode back in the late afternoon, with the sun going sideways across the mesa, and the sky turning colors that the east did not really do, that particular layering of amber and rose and deep blue that the Texas evening produced in September. Neither of them spoke for most of the ride, but it was no longer the careful silence of 2 strangers. It had become the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been engaged in something together and are now at rest. At some point Reuben said, "Cross's registration date." "If it's recent," she said, "then someone manufactured this, which means it could be challenged on fraud grounds rather than just technical title grounds, which is a stronger position." "How do you know that?" "I read," she said simply. He looked at her profile in the amber light, the straight nose, the set of her chin, the slight crease at the corner of her eye that suggested she squinted into a lot of sun. He looked away before she noticed. Hargreaves sent a note the following Wednesday. The document had been registered with the county clerk on August the 14th of 1878. The alleged original transfer it described had occurred in 1869. A 9-year gap between a transaction and its registration in the county records was, Hargreaves noted with what passed for excitement in his vocabulary, highly irregular. He was filing a countermotion based on fraud before the week was out. Reuben read the note at the kitchen table and looked up. Ella was pouring coffee with her back to him. He said, "Hargreaves found the registration date." She turned. One eyebrow went up slightly. "August the 14th, he said. "This year." She set down the coffee pot. She said very quietly, "Good." "That was your question," she said. "It was the obvious question." He said, "I have been dealing with this situation for almost a year and nobody asked it." She met his eyes across the kitchen, and there was a moment, a specific and identifiable moment, in which something between them moved into different territory. Not dramatically, not with any kind of declaration. Just a quiet shift, the way the air shifts before rain when you can feel the change before you can see it. She said, "Reuben." It was the first time she had used his given name. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a door opening in a previously closed room. "I need to know something," she said. "Not about the ranch, about whether you want me to stay." The question landed with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its size. He stood up from the table. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not a man who found language quickly when the thing that needed to be said was something he felt deeply. He crossed the kitchen, which was not a large kitchen, and he stopped an arm's length from her, and he said, "I rode out to that waystation with a list of reasons why you should go back. I couldn't say a single one of them." She watched him. "That was 3 weeks ago," he said. "I understand it better now." "Do you?" she said, and it was not entirely a question. "I understand," he said carefully, "that you are the most capable person I have spent extended time with in my adult life, and that I am not ready for you to leave, and that I should have said that sooner instead of waiting for you to ask." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. She said, "That may be the longest speech you have made since I arrived." "It may be," he said. She picked up the coffee and poured it for him and set it on the table without another word, and he sat back down. But when she sat across from him and their eyes met over the cups, there was nothing uncertain in it anymore. The weeks that followed were the making of something. Not quickly, not in the breathless fashion of romantic stories told by people who have never actually built anything, but steadily, and with the particular weight of two people choosing each other deliberately rather than falling into an arrangement. Reuben asked her in the evenings about Cincinnati and about the school, and about the boy who had learned to read from tin cans. She told him with the particular animation she reserved for things she cared about, her hands moving slightly on the table, her voice losing the careful, measured quality it carried the rest of the time. He listened in the way she had first identified as rare, the way that said he was actually hearing what she said and not simply waiting for his turn. She asked him about his father, because she knew from the letters that this was the loss he had not fully processed, the way some losses sit in you and do not diminish because you have not allowed yourself to fully feel them. He was quiet for a long time after she asked. Then he talked, more than he had talked about it to anyone, including Pete. He talked about the last winter, and the things his father had said, and the particular unbearable quality of watching someone you love become less than themselves. She listened without offering comfort that would have felt hollow, which was the exactly right thing to do. She told him about her mother. Her mother had been a woman with a fierce intelligence and no outlet for it except the management of a house and the education of two children. And Ella had grown up understanding that the distance between what a woman was capable of and what she was permitted to do was a kind of daily grief, low grade and chronic, and never mentioned because there was no point in mentioning it. This, she told him, was why she had valued his letter. Not because it was romantic, but because he had described her future role in practical terms that assumed she would have won, rather than decorative terms that assumed she would be an ornament. "I'm not sure I'm a romantic man," he said, one evening when the fire was low. "I know," she said. "Does that bother you?" She considered. "The men I've known who were the most romantic were often the least trustworthy," she said. "There's a kind of romantic who is performing. It's much easier to trust someone who is simply present." He looked at her. "Are you saying you trust me?" "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that I'm getting there." He understood that this was significant. He said, "I'm getting there too." In early October, 10 days before the court date, something happened that changed the temperature of everything between them. Reuben had ridden out to the southern pasture in the morning to check on a section of fence that Pete had reported as weakened, and he had taken a longer route back because he wanted to look at the river access on the eastern border, the pastures that were the subject of the land dispute. He had not been out to that section since Cross's claim had been filed, because he had found that looking at the land he might lose made the situation harder to reason through clearly. He stood his horse at the bank of the river and looked at the line of cottonwoods and the particular quality of the grass along the water, which was green even in September because of the river influence, and he felt the specific anger that had been living underneath the legal anxiety since Cross first arrived. It was not a destructive anger. It was the kind that came from having built something and having someone try to take it. He rode back in the late afternoon and found Ella at the south end of the yard talking to a man he did not recognize. The man was on horseback and was leaning down from the saddle in the particular posture of someone making a point, and even from a distance Reuben could see the set of Ella's shoulders, which was not the relaxed set of a friendly conversation. He pushed his horse into a faster pace. When he arrived, he did not immediately speak. He looked at the man on the horse. The man was perhaps 40, well dressed in the manner of someone who wanted to suggest money without being obvious about it, with an expensive hat and a horse that had been chosen for appearance as much as utility. He had the particular kind of face that had once been handsome and now showed the costs of certain choices. "Bancroft," the man said pleasantly. "Cross," said Reuben, because of course it was Dalton Cross. Cross looked between Reuben and Ella with a smile that had something cold at the edges. "I was simply introducing myself to your housekeeper," he said. "I am not his housekeeper," Ella said, in the tone she had used with Morrison, which was perfectly even and left no room for argument. Cross's smile held. "My apologies, ma'am. I was under the impression this was a bachelor establishment." "Your impressions are frequently incorrect," Ella said. "That seems to extend to legal documents as well." Cross's smile stopped being a smile. He looked at Reuben. He said, "I came to make a proposal. A practical one. I'm willing to settle out of court. I'll accept a cash payment for the eastern 320 acres rather than the court ruling on the full claim." Reuben said, "How much?" Cross named a figure that was roughly what Reuben had spent on the legal fight so far, which meant Cross knew the legal fight was not going well and wanted out before October the 8th. Hargreaves had been right about the registration date. Reuben looked at Ella. He did not know why he looked at Ella except that he had come to feel that her read on a situation was a resource, and he was not too proud to use it. She gave the slightest shake of her head. So small Cross would not have seen it. Reuben looked back at Cross. He said, "No." Cross's expression shifted into something that was not quite a threat but was the border territory adjacent to one. He said, "The court date is 10 days out, Bancroft. I'd think carefully." "I've thought carefully," Reuben said. "Get off my land." Cross held his ground for another moment, which was the moment of a man deciding whether he has something to press with, and then he apparently decided he did not, and he turned his horse and rode out at a pace that was meant to suggest he was not being sent away. After he was gone, Reuben looked at Ella. She was still watching the road where Cross had ridden. "He's scared," she said. "I know. He came in person. That wasn't necessary if this was a strong position." "I know." She turned to look at him. The afternoon sun was full on her face, and there was a brightness in her eyes that was not just the light, a sharpness that he recognized as anger, and underneath it something else. Something that was there for him, not for the legal situation, not for the ranch, but specifically for him. "Don't settle," she said. "Don't give him anything." "I'm not going to," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the yard with the cattle sounds in the middle distance and the late sun running long shadows across the dust. Reuben said, "Are you all right?" "Did he say anything before I got there?" "He asked if I was lonely out here," she said. "I told him I was extremely occupied." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same territory. She made a sound that was slightly more clearly a laugh, and then she put a hand briefly on his arm. The first time she had touched him with that kind of intentionality, just the lightest pressure of her fingers above his wrist, and then she walked back toward the house. He stood in the yard for a moment after she went inside. He realized with something between wonder and resignation, fully and irrevocably done for. The court date on October the 8th was the most significant day Reuben had spent in a courtroom, which was not saying much because he had spent very few days in courtrooms. It was held in the county courthouse in Laredo, a low adobe building with a tin roof that amplified the sound of the morning wind. Judge Aldrich was a compact man with the face of someone who had long ago decided that all of humanity was guilty of something and was simply waiting to determine of what. Hargreaves presented the fraud argument with the particular dry precision of a man who believed that facts stated plainly were more persuasive than facts dramatized. The registration date of August 1878 for a document allegedly created in 1869. The absence of any record of the transaction in the county books of 1869. The fact that the specific legal language in the document used phrasing that had not been standardized in Texas land patent law until 1875. Cross's lawyer, a florid man named Beaumont who apparently relied on volume and confidence in inverse proportion to legal substance, objected strenuously to this last point on grounds that Reuben could not quite follow. Judge Aldrich overruled with the expression of a man who had heard this particular argument before. Ella had come to the courthouse. She sat in the gallery. She had dressed carefully that morning in a dark green wool dress that was the most formal thing she owned, and she sat very still throughout the proceedings with her hands folded in her lap, her gray eyes moving between Hargreaves and Cross's lawyer, and the judge with the same lateral intelligence she brought to everything. Cross himself was present, in the front row on the other side, And once during the proceedings, he turned and found her watching him with an expression of complete composure, and he looked away first. The ruling came at 2 in the afternoon. Judge Aldrich ruled that the document presented by Cross's representation showed evidence of having been created or substantially altered after the date it claimed to represent, that the registration gap of 9 years was irregular and unexplained, and that the specific legal phrasing used in the document was anachronistic relative to its claimed date. He ruled in favor of Bancroft. He also noted, in language that was notably pointed for a judicial ruling, that the court took a serious view of attempts to defraud property holders through manufactured documentation, and that if any party to this proceeding wished to consider that note carefully before any future proceedings in Craddock County, the court would not object. Cross left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Reuben shook Hargreaves's hand, which was the most emotional gesture he made in public. Hargreaves told him with modest pride that the registration date argument had been the right argument, and he would be sending his final bill, which reflected the reduced engagement time. Reuben turned and found Ella in the gallery doorway. She had her coat on, prepared for the ride back. Her face was calm, but her eyes were the opposite of calm. He walked toward her and she walked toward him, and they met in the doorway, and she said quietly, "You won." "We won," he said. She looked at him. He meant it in the most literal possible sense, and both of them understood it. He said, "Ella," she said, "I know." He said, "I would like to ask you something." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Will you stop finishing my sentences before I can say them?" "Then say them," she said, with the corner of her mouth moving in that way it had. He said, "I would like you to marry me. Not because of the original arrangement and not because of the ranch, because you are the only person I have ever met who asks the right question at the right time, and I would like that for the rest of my life." She was quiet for a moment. The courthouse door behind her was letting in the October wind and the sounds of Laredo and the smell of dust and horses. She said, "That is the most unromantic proposal I have ever received." He said, "I told you I wasn't a romantic man." She said, "I know. I accepted that 3 weeks ago." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, Reuben, I will marry you." He let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like several months. They were married in Laredo on the 23rd of October, 1878, in the small church on the main street, with Pete Holloway as witness, and the Reverend Hale officiating, and a small group of county residents who had come because news traveled in Craddock County, and people had opinions about the Bancroft land case, and were generally pleased by its resolution. Ella wore her dark green dress because it was the best she had, and because she had decided that marrying a practical man in a practical dress was its own kind of statement. Reuben wore his good jacket and a new shirt that Pete had informed him he needed to purchase. The Reverend Hale had them repeat the traditional vows, and Reuben repeated them with the steady deliberateness of a man making a promise he intends to keep, which was the only way he made promises. When it came to the part about cherishing, he looked at Ella and she looked at him, and it was not a performance. It had the specific gravity of two people who have already looked at each other clearly and chosen to keep looking. Afterward there was a small supper at the hotel, and then they rode back to Silver Creek in the early evening with the stars coming out, which in Texas in October were more stars than most people from the east had ever seen, the sky crammed with them from horizon to horizon. Ella looked up while they were riding and said, "I was not prepared for this." "For what?" "The stars," she said. "In Cincinnati you can see stars, but not like this." He looked up. He had lived under these stars for so long that he had stopped seeing them. "No," he said, "not like this." They rode the rest of the way home in the starlit silence, and when they arrived at Silver Creek it was their home together, officially and completely, and the front room had a fire in it because Pete had thought to light one before he went to the bunkhouse. The winter of 1878 and 1879 was the first winter Reuben Bancroft had spent in the company of another person in the house since his father's death, and it was profoundly different from what he had expected. in the way that most things involving Ella Norris were profoundly different from what he had expected. He had expected adjustment and discomfort, the friction of two established patterns of life rubbing against each other. There was some of that. She organized things in the kitchen in a way that was rational but different from his system, and it took him 2 weeks to stop reaching for things in the wrong places. He left boots in the front room, and she moved them to the porch with a patient consistency that communicated her position without requiring a discussion. He worked late and came in past supper sometimes, and she saved food but made clear once that she preferred to know in advance. But mostly it was not friction. Mostly it was warmth, the specific warmth of not being alone in the house when the wind came down from the north, of having a light on in the kitchen when you came in from the dark, of sitting by the fire in the evening in the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. She had begun working with Pete on the ranch accounts in a more systematic way, which Pete had submitted to with the good sense of a man who recognized organizational competence when he encountered it. The ranch's books had been kept adequately but not well, with a tendency toward vagueness in the smaller expenditures that she found troubling. She created a proper ledger system and began tracking costs against production in a way that allowed them to see, for the first time with clarity, which parts of the operation were profitable and which were marginal. The eastern pastures, now indisputably secured, turned out to be the most productive section of the ranch by a significant margin once the numbers were laid out properly. The river access meant the cattle on that section maintained weight through the dry periods that stressed the animals on the western range. It was exactly the section Cross had tried to take, which told you something about Cross's eye for value, even if nothing else admirable could be said about him. Reuben absorbed all of this with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been working with incomplete information and can now see the full picture. He expanded the herd in the eastern pastures in the spring of 1879, a calculated investment that Ella had argued for and that paid off in the fall roundup. In the winter evenings, she read to him. This had started somewhat accidentally, when she had been reading a novel and he had come in and sat down and she had read a passage aloud because it was striking, and he had listened, and then asked what came next. She had read the next passage. By the time they finished the chapter, reading aloud had become a thing they did, and it continued through the winter and beyond. He was not a man who read for pleasure on his own, not because he was unable but because he had never had the stillness for it, but listening to her voice in the firelit front room with the ranch sounds settled for the night was a different kind of reading. He found that he followed stories when they were told this way, followed the characters and their hidden motives, and the choices they made and the things that drove them. Once, during a particularly fraught passage in which a character made a decision based on pride rather than sense, Reuben said quietly he should have just said what was true. Ella lowered the book and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "he should have." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I nearly didn't that morning when I rode out." She set the book in her lap. She said, "I know," he said, "I was going to put you on the Thursday stage." "I know," she said again. "You told me." "What I didn't tell you," he said, "was that I had been frightened since June, when I understood what the letters had become. I had built something in those letters and it terrified me." She watched him. "Because if you came," he said, "it would be real, and if it was real it could be lost." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. Then she said, "I was frightened too. Every letter I sent I thought, this is too much, this is too honest, he will read this and think I'm foolish or strange. And then I thought, if I am not honest and something good comes of it, it will not be built on anything real. And if you were honest and something good came of it," he said, "then it would be real," she said, "which it is." He looked at her across the fire. She looked at him. She was the most real thing in his life. She had been the most real thing in his life since the morning at the waystation when she had watched him ride down from the ridge and told him plainly that she could see he had something difficult to say. He said, "I love you." It was the first time he had said it. He had felt it for months, in the specific inarticulate way that a man who is not given to declarations feels things, but he had not said it, and saying it now felt like stepping off a ledge, the terrifying and also correct thing. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He waited. She said, "I love you too. I have for a while." She paused. "Since the day you told Hargreaves that whoever ran the household should run the accounts." He said, "That was practical common sense." She said, "Yes, that is the point." He crossed the front room and sat down next to her on the settee, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she leaned against him slightly, and they stayed like that while the fire burned down, her with the book still in her lap and him with his arm around her, and the wind outside and the stars above them, and it was the most at home Reuben Bancroft had ever felt in his adult life. The spring of 1879 brought several things. It brought the expansion of the eastern herd, and the replanting of the kitchen garden that Ella had redesigned over the winter, with a practicality that balanced what the ground could support with what the household actually needed. It brought a visit from Reuben's brother Gideon, who came up from New Mexico with his wife Marguerite for 2 weeks in April, and who met Ella with the suspicious caution of an older brother and left 12 days later with what he later wrote to Reuben, was an assessment that she was the best thing that had happened to him and possibly to the ranch, in that order. It brought a letter from Ella's brother Thomas in Cleveland, the printer's apprentice, who had heard through their correspondence that she had married and who wrote with a warmth that told Reuben something about the family she had come from, the basic decency of the remaining Norris siblings. And it brought, in May, the news that changed everything in the best possible way. Ella told him on a Sunday morning in May when the spring was full and green along the river, and the air smelled like everything alive. She told him plainly in the way she did everything without preamble or performance. She was expecting a child, by her calculation in the late autumn. Reuben sat down. He sat down because his legs had decided independently that this was the appropriate response, and then he stood back up because sitting seemed wrong, and then he stood in the kitchen looking at her with an expression she would later describe to him as the only time she had ever seen him genuinely at a loss. He crossed the kitchen. He put his hands on her face and he kissed her, which he had done before, but not quite like this, not with this specific weight of gratitude and wonder and a love so large he had no language for it. She put her hands over his and said, against his mouth, "So you're pleased?" He said, "Ella," she said, "is that an answer?" He said, "Yes." She laughed. She put her forehead against his chest and laughed quietly, and he held her. And outside the window the spring was happening in all its extravagant abundance, and Silver Creek Ranch was real and secure and alive, and the man who had ridden out on a September morning to turn a woman away was holding her and could not imagine any other version of his life. Pete Holloway, when told, produced from somewhere a bottle of good bourbon that he had apparently been saving and poured 3 glasses on the porch in the afternoon sun, and raised his without a toast, because Pete was not a man for speeches either, and they drank to the fact of it without needing to say what the fact was. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The cattle drive in late summer yielded the best returns Silver Creek had seen, partly because of the expanded eastern herd, and partly because Ella had spent the spring corresponding with buyers in San Antonio and had secured a contract at a fixed price per head that protected them against the market volatility that had hurt many ranchers that year. She had done this through the mail with her characteristic combination of research and precision, and when Reuben reviewed the contract with Hargreaves and Hargreaves said it was excellent terms, Reuben had said he knew. She had grown into the ranch in a way that was both natural and specifically her own. She had not tried to become a rancher's wife in the conventional sense, the sense that meant staying in the house and managing the domestic sphere and leaving the real work to the men. She had not tried to become a rancher either, because she had no desire to pretend to skills she had not developed. She had become something more specific, the kind of partner who understood the whole operation as a system and contributed the things she was best positioned to contribute, which were organizational clarity, negotiation, and the kind of strategic thinking that came from being a person who read widely and thought laterally. Pete had long since stopped being surprised by her. He had started, somewhere around December of 1878, simply treating her as a colleague with a complementary skill set, which was the highest compliment Pete Holloway was capable of paying anyone. The other ranchers and their families in Craddock County had initially not known what to make of Ella Bancroft. The county had a social structure, and she did not fit neatly into it, being neither the decorative wife of a prosperous rancher nor the working woman of necessity, but something in between that did not have a clear category. This had resolved itself over time, as these things generally do, because she was too consistently useful and decent to remain categorized as unusual. And by the summer of 1879, she was simply Ella Bancroft, the woman who had helped the Hargrove family through the fever outbreak in March, and who had set up a small lending library of books in the front parlor of the church on Sundays, and who had quietly and without public comment supported the establishment of a school for the children of the Mexican families who worked the ranches in the county, because she was a teacher, and she understood that children who could not read became adults with fewer options, and fewer options was the condition. She had spent her whole life refusing to accept as natural. Reuben had supported the school effort without needing to be convinced, which had confirmed something she had believed about him since his letter in March of 1878. He was not a progressive man in the ideological sense. He was something simpler and rarer, a man whose basic decency operated faster than his social programming. In late November of 1879, as the weather was turning cold and the ranch was settling into its winter rhythms, their son was born. They named him James, after Reuben's father, and William after Ella's, which meant his full name was James William Bancroft, and from the first moment Reuben held him in the cold November bedroom, with the lamp turned up high and Ella exhausted and watching him from the pillow. He understood something about the arrangement of the world that he had not previously understood. The way a person can contain a love so specific and so large that it reorganizes everything around it. James William Bancroft was a healthy, substantial, loudly opinionated infant who slept in patterns that suggested he had strong feelings about when sleeping was appropriate and when it was not, and who looked at his parents from his first weeks with the wide, evaluating gaze of someone who had arrived with a great deal to assess. Reuben held him in the evenings sometimes in the front room by the fire when Ella was sleeping, and he talked to him quietly. He told him about the ranch and the river and the cottonwoods along the eastern border. He told him about the morning at the waystation. He told him about the letters, though James was not yet in a position to appreciate the significance of letters, and about the 3 questions at the end of the first one, and about what it meant to be the kind of man who listened. James regarded all of this with the tolerant attentiveness of the very young and went to sleep on Reuben's chest, and Reuben sat with him and did not move and looked at the fire. The years that followed were the years of building, the slow, daily, deeply satisfying work of a life being constructed deliberately and well. The ranch grew in the way that good ranches grow, not dramatically but steadily, with each year's decisions made on the basis of clear information and realistic assessment. By 1882, Silver Creek ran over 200 head and had added a second full-time hand named Luis Vega, who had come recommended by the family of the Mexican workers who attended the county school that Ella had supported, and who turned out to be one of the most skilled cattle handlers Reuben had ever worked with. The school had grown too. What had started as 2 mornings a week in the back of the church had become a formal school with its own small building on the south end of Laredo, with a trained teacher hired, and a small board of parents and community members overseeing it. Ella had been the one who drafted the proposal to the county, who had found the funding through a combination of county allocation and private contributions, who had corresponded with a teachers' college in San Antonio to find a qualified candidate. The school served 31 children by 1882, and when it opened its doors on the first official day, Ella had stood at the back of the room with Reuben beside her and watched the children come in and find their seats. And she had said nothing, but he had felt the significance of it in the way she stood, the particular quiet pride of someone watching a thing they fought for become real. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood like that while the schoolroom filled up. In the spring of 1882, they had their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose, and in the summer of 1884 their third, another son named Thomas after Ella's brother, who by this time had moved from Cleveland to San Antonio and visited Silver Creek every other year with an increasing tendency to bring books that were not available in Craddock County. The house had changed by then. The 4 rooms had become 6, with an addition Reuben and Pete and Louis had built in the winter of 1881, and the front room had real furniture and 3 shelves of books and a braided rug that Ella had made over the course of 2 winters, working at it in the evenings when the children were asleep. The kitchen had a good stove that replaced the original and a window that faced east so the morning light came in, which Ella had specified when they were planning the addition, because she said there was no reason a kitchen should face the wrong way. Reuben had built what she specified. He always did, not because he lacked opinions, but because her opinions were usually right, and he had long since made his peace with this being one of the organizing facts of his domestic life. They had their arguments, because real people in real marriages do. They argued about the expansion of the northern pasture in 1881, which Reuben wanted and Ella thought was premature given the cost of the house addition and the uncertain cattle market that year. She was right and he knew it, and he did not do the expansion until 1883, when the market had stabilized, and it was the right decision. They argued once about James's education, Reuben feeling that the boy should start working the ranch seriously at 10, and Ella believing firmly that he should have several more years of formal schooling. And on this point, Reuben yielded not simply because she was right, but because he recognized that his own instinct was partly coming from his own history, rather than from what was actually best for James. James went to school in Laredo until he was 13, by which time he could read and write with competence and do arithmetic, and had developed a fascination with engineering that would eventually take him to a school in Austin, and then to a career building railroad bridges, though none of them knew that yet in 1882. What they knew was that he was a bright, curious, occasionally exasperating child who had his father's physical stillness and his mother's lateral mind, and who would sit in the front room in the evenings listening to Ella read, aloud with the absorbed attention of a small person who understood that stories contained information about how the world worked. Clara was different, smaller and fiercer, with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and from the age of 3 had opinions about everything and the vocal willingness to share them that had not come directly from either parent but was recognizable from both. She followed Luis Vega around the ranch from the time she could walk, absorbing information about horses and cattle with the single-minded enthusiasm of someone who had identified her calling early. By the time she was 7, she could ride as well as most of the adult hands. Thomas, the youngest, was quieter than either sibling, with a thoughtful quality that reminded Ella of Reuben's letters, the careful consideration before the response. He was the one who sat close to her in the evenings and asked questions about Cincinnati and about Ohio and about what it had been like to be a teacher. He seemed to be building a picture of the world before his own birth, making sense of the sequence of things that had led to his existence. On the evening of his 6th birthday, in the summer of 1890, Thomas asked his mother how she had known his father was the right person to come to. Ella thought about this with the seriousness his question deserved. She said he asked the right question. Thomas considered this. He said, "What question?" she said. "He told me what was true even when it was difficult to say, and then he asked whether I wanted to stay." Thomas thought about this for a while. Then he said, "And you did?" "I did," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to the carved horse Reuben had been making him. And Ella looked across the kitchen table at her husband, who had heard all of this, and who was looking at her with the expression he had never lost, the one that said she had just said exactly the right thing. By the fall of 1893, Silver Creek Ranch had become something that could be called prosperous without embarrassment. The 200 head had become 400. Pete Holloway had retired the previous year with enough money saved and enough goodwill in the county to keep him comfortable, and his position had been taken by Louis Vega, who had turned out to be not just a skilled cattle handler, but a man of organizational intelligence who Pete himself had recommended with the particular conviction of someone who knows his own successor when he sees one. 2 additional hands rounded out the operation. The legal matter of Dalton Cross had resolved itself in the most final of all possible ways when Cross died in San Antonio in 1885, apparently of the kind of complications that come from a life of stress and questionable choices. His estate was complicated and largely without value. Hargreaves, who had sent them a note about this with the characteristic restraint of a man who did not gloat but had earned the right to, retired in 1891 and was succeeded by a younger lawyer in Laredo who had been told, apparently, that the Bancroft account was a good one and to treat it accordingly. On a September morning in 1893, 15 years after the morning that had started everything, Reuben Bancroft saddled his horse in the early light and rode out along the eastern border. He did this sometimes, not from habit but from choice, because the eastern pastures were still the best part of the ranch, and the river in September was the river at its finest, the cottonwoods turning and the water running clear. He rode to the ridge above the eastern border, the ridge that looked toward Laredo, and he stopped and looked at the land. And he thought about the morning in 1878 when he had ridden to a different ridge above a different piece of country to turn away a woman he had never seen, and how the words had left him the moment he saw her face, and how he had never recovered them, and how he had never wanted to. He heard a horse behind him and turned, and Ella came up the ridge because she had heard him saddling and had decided to come, which was a thing she did sometimes, and which he had stopped being surprised by long ago. She stopped her horse next to his. They looked out at the eastern pasture together, at the cottonwoods and the river and the cattle grazing in the early light. She said, "Do you remember?" He said, "Every morning." She looked at him. He looked at her. The 15 years were in her face, but so was the woman at the waystation, the woman with the traveling case and the 3 precise questions and the loose strand of hair and the refusal to perform what she did not feel. She was 41 and her hair had a thread of gray in it that she had not commented on, and he had not mentioned because there was nothing to mention. She was the most beautiful person he had ever looked at, and she was also the most capable and the most honest and the most infuriating when she was right about something he had wanted to be right about himself, and she was his wife and his partner and his home. He said, "I have been thinking about the northern boundary." She said, immediately, "Louis mentioned it. He thinks we could extend another 40 acres if the water rights hold." He said, "They'll hold. I checked with the county last week." She said, "Then we should discuss it properly." He said, "We are discussing it properly." She looked at him, he looked at her. The same corner of her mouth moved in the same way it had moved on a courthouse doorway in October of 1878. She said, "You know, for a man who rode out to turn me away, you have had a great deal to say for the past 15 years. He said, "You stayed." "I stayed," she agreed. He said, "Best decision either of us ever made." She looked out at the eastern pasture and the river and the cottonwoods in the early September light, and she said, "Yes, it was." They rode back to the ranch together in the morning quiet, side by side, the way they had walked the road from the waystation to Laredo on the first day, and the way they had ridden back from Laredo after the court ruling, and after the wedding, and after every ride they had taken together since. The way two people move who have been moving together for long enough that the distance between them has become something natural and settled and right. The ranch came into view as they crested the last low rise before the yard, the adobe house with its wooden porch and 6 rooms, and the shelves of books and the braided rug, and the east-facing kitchen window, the bunkhouse and the barn and the corrals, and smoke beginning to come from the kitchen chimney, because Thomas was 14 now, and had recently discovered that he enjoyed cooking breakfast, a development that his older siblings had embraced with enthusiasm. Clara's horse was already in the corral with the saddle still on it, which meant she had been out since dawn doing whatever she had decided needed doing, with or without instruction, in the manner of Clara Bancroft. James was in Austin, at the school, and had written last month with a careful diagram of the bridge design he was working on and a question about the load-bearing capacity of the river bottom at the eastern Silver Creek crossing, which had made Reuben and Ella both laugh and then discuss it seriously, because it was a serious question. Everything was here. Everything had been built and was real and was theirs. Reuben helped Ella down from her horse at the hitching post, which was a formality she did not need and had never needed, but which he offered because it was what you did when you loved someone and had the chance to. She took his hand as she stepped down and held it for a moment after her feet were on the ground. She said, "I'm glad you couldn't say the words," he said. "What words?" she said. "Whatever you were going to say when you rode out that morning. I'm glad they left you." He thought about the ridge above the waystation and the rehearsed speech and the way everything had simply gone out of him when she turned. He said, "They left me the moment I saw your face." She looked at him with those gray eyes that he had been looking into for 15 years and that still, in the specific morning light of a September in 1893, had the power to stop him. She said, "I know, and you stayed." He said, "I stayed." She said, "Good." And she walked up onto the porch and into the house, and from inside came the sound of Thomas at the stove and Clara's voice saying something loud and opinionated about the saddle, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and Reuben Bancroft stood on his porch in the September morning and looked at Silver Creek Ranch and understood with the full weight of his adult life exactly what it meant to have almost ridden away from everything that mattered. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The morning light moved across the yard and caught the river in the distance and the cottonwoods along the eastern border, all of it solid and real and his, not by accident or inheritance, but by the particular combination of work and honesty, and the single best decision he had ever made, which was to ride down from a ridge toward a woman he did not know, and to let the words he had rehearsed dissolve into the September air and to stay.